This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is crime films. I am joined by Connor Crockford, and we will start the discussion when we return. The subject is crime films, from slasher films to gangster films to the old film noirs. I'm joined by Connor Crockford. He is a writer who has written on many subjects, and as I usually like to do, I'll let him have a few minutes to explain who he is, what he does, etc., etc. So welcome, Connor. Before we dig into crime films, let's dig in a little bit into yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And why are you here?
All right. Hey, Dan, thanks for having me. So I am a critic, I'm a poet, I'm an editor. I write essays, I wear a lot of hats. I'm based in Philadelphia, where I write about movies, I write about television, books, poetry reviews. And I have a debut collection of poetry coming out next month from Alien Buddha Press called Bird Songs. So that's where I'm at.
Um, so I know you had spoken when I contacted you regarding a review you had done, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago on Degrassi High, or one of the iterations of that Canadian TV franchise. It's interesting because there are certain topics or whatnot that you think you could find a lot of people, but then you contact them and either they only did a one-off or they didn't do anything. Have you found that yourself when you're researching something, you think it's going to be an easy thing to research or write about, and then it turns out that it's ridiculously difficult to find someone or some source?
Oh yeah, that's always a problem. I mean, I just did an article last year on the Philadelphia film labor, um, and that was pretty difficult because you're going back to silent film, you're going back to 100-year-old factories and explosions, stuff like that. So it is tricky. It depends on the source and the material, though. Sometimes people will have tons of crazy archives and treasure troves to dig into.
Now, also, before we just get into the crime film genre, another thing that hopefully we'll have a further discussion or two or three, because you had mentioned a number of things that you were interested in, but you also wrote to me in an email about neurodivergence and whatnot. For people who don't know, what is neurodivergence, and secondly, how has that affected your writing, pro or con?
Yeah, I'm autistic ADHD. Neurodivergence is obviously a complicated subject. Basically, it just means that your brain works a little differently from other people. Obsessive compulsive disorder is now considered neurodivergence. It really depends. The DSM has expanded that term pretty wildly, but it just means that your cognitive functions are just different from other people's. You might need certain things, or you don't read social cues very easily. For me personally, I have a lot of special interests that I really fixate on. My brain responds differently to certain tasks and certain materials compared to other people. Like working on something I'm not interested in is actively harder for me because of my ADHD. My energy gets depleted easily from sensory overload, sensory issues. It really varies, but it affects my writing in the sense that I think my responses to sensory triggers are much stronger than other people's. So when I write about that in my work, it tends to be a little more ecstatic or a little bigger set feeling.
All right, well, let's turn to the subject of crime films. This was one of the things you had mentioned in our emails. So, did you grow up watching crime films? What was the first crime film you saw? Did you watch, say, Old Bogey or Cagney films with your dad? How did you get into that genre?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Bogart because I watched a lot of Bogart with my dad and my mother. So Casablanca was my dad's favorite movie, but then, I'm like, this Bogart guy is amazing. So I end up watching The Maltese Falcon, I watched The Big Sleep, I watched Key Largo. As an adult, I watched In a Lonely Place, which is a fantastic Nicholas Ray movie about Bogart as a screenwriter who may or may not be guilty of murder. Um, so Bogart was a big influence for me. But my dad also had me watching cop movies, like Lethal Weapon was a big one, of course. Films like that, and then as I get older, I get more interested in noir and like hard-boiled crime genre stuff. So books, but also films. Postman Always Rings Twice, Double Indemnity.
Yeah. I knew I personally was more of a Cagney fan than a Bogart fan, even though he was more obviously theatrical. Both of them came from that old line sort of theatricality. They didn't have the naturalism that started, with the new wave or so in the 60s. But so you mentioned several Bogart films. I think the first film that I can recall of Bogart where he wasn't just playing the heavy or just a cartoonish heavy was The Petrified Forest, where he's on the run and he's being hunted down. I think it's by U.S. Marshals or whatnot. Which film of Bogart's do you think is one your favorite and second the best, assuming that they might be different?
I actually haven't seen Petrified Forest yet, which I
Oh, okay.
regret. But the best Bogart film, I think I might have to go with Maltese Falcon.
Hmm.
In terms of his crime pictures, I think that's just an extraordinary movie. To this day, even if it has a different ending than the novel, obviously the Hammett novel. Um, so I would go with that one. I'm also really loved In a Lonely Place. I think his performance there is pretty incredible. It feels very personal compared to his other movies. But I think you're right about Cagney, by the way, because watching Public Enemy, I was really struck by that. I was like, this guy is a method actor. He is just exploding on the screen. It doesn't feel like anything in 1930 at all. It's astonishing.
Yeah. Other people from that era, bigger names, crime actors, be like Peter Lorre, George Raft, who reputedly was a real life gangster before he became an actor.
Mm,
Um,
hmm.
John Garfield was another one
Yeah.
who later came in. He was a favorite of my dad too. Uh, um, which of those kinds of guys who would have been, I guess, second tier below the Cagney Bogart level, captured you the most, with at least within the crime films? Tyrone Power, another one in Nightmare Alley, gave a great performance.
Oh, I just saw Nightmare Alley. Yeah, Power is extraordinary in that movie. It's really interesting because he was such a beautiful face,
Mm.
and
Well, he was
he
a
would
pretty boy
be.
when he started out.
Yeah, he was a pretty boy, and what's great about Nightmare Alley is he's playing someone who is kind of this selfish cipher, and he uses his looks to trap women, which is very unusual for noir. Usually it's the other way around,
Yeah.
but in Nightmare Alley, all these women are really beguiled by him. Yeah, I would say John Garfield as well. I love The Postman Rings Twice. A problem with the 80s remake is that Jack Nicholson does not look like a drifter, like even a handsome drifter. He looks like Jack Nicholson.
Yeah.
And John Garfield looks like a guy who's been through some crap and he's just in the gutter.
Hmm.
So,
How about some of the? Have you seen any like the German expressionist films? M is the most famous crime film that came out in that era with Peter Lorre as a pedophilic child killer. But there's also the Mabuse films. Have you ever seen any of the Dr. Mabuse films?
I actually haven't. That is on my list though.
Okay.
Those look amazing. I love German Expressionism though. Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, of course.
Mm.
Which is a crime film, but more of like the first horror film. Really, it's an interesting mix.
Well, yeah, because he's basically almost uh, the old world zombie, the Haitian zombie kind.
Hmm.
He's not a Night of the Dead zombie. He's an old fashioned zombie under the control of someone else, and so it gets into the ideas of who's really at fault here. Who's the real criminal?
Hmm.
The one who's the manipulator, or the one who's the zombie?
Right.
So let's then get into since we covering the early part of it, film noir. Film noir, obviously came from German expressionism, at least in terms of the visuals and
Hmm.
the
Oh yeah.
technical cues. Who is the fellow who? There's the famous scene with the guy who plays a psychopath who pushes the woman in a wheelchair down the stairs. Do you know that? Remember
Yes. Yeah.
what
Is
was his
that
name?
so? There's Battleship Potemkin. Is the Odessa step sequence, but then there's the Untouchables.
Yeah. No, let me look. It's a guy. He's a psychopath, and he pushes an old lady in a wheelchair down the steps. I can't. It'll come to me eventually.
For sure.
But the whole noir genre. You mentioned Double Indemnity, and we'd have
Yeah.
to also talk about Hitchcock. Where do you think Hitchcock slots into this?
Hitchcock is so interesting because he is obsessed with guilty men, but they're often genuinely wronged. They tend to be innocent. North by Northwest, of course, Sabotage. 39 Steps is a famous one. Man Who Knew Too Much, which features, a great performance from Peter Lorre. But Hitchcock's interesting because he introduces a lot of really pitch black humor into the proceedings. He's a filmmaker who's hard to make fun of because he kind of makes fun of himself.
Yeah.
He's a very dry sense of humor. And I think what he did best was forcing the audience to sympathize with someone they didn't expect, like in Psycho, which is such an important movie for slashers and serial killer films. That is just a groundbreaking piece of work. And also, he did not. What did he say? Didn't he say you have to play the audience like a piano? Isn't that his famous line?
Well, that and also act as a chattel, basically.
Actors are chattel. Yeah, yeah, which is so weird. Very strange, dark man Hitchcock. But yeah, here is this guy. He has this incredibly pervasively cynical view of human nature too, but it's not in a way. He's not chastising the audience for feeling this way. He actually finds this all very amusing. This was a guy with a strong sense of humor. So I think what he brings to crime films is a sense of humor, like strong humor, very black humor. And he also creates this situation where we are sympathizing with people we don't expect, like Jimmy Stewart in Rear Window, who is this voyeur looking at other people's lives. Vertigo too, these very obsessive characters. In Psycho, Norman Bates, when he sinks the car, you want him to sink the car. You've been following Marion for the entire movie, right, up to that point. And then when she dies, you're kind of a Norman. You want him to bury the body.
Yeah, and he has throughout his filmography so many different types of murderers and crimes committed. I mean, you have The Lodger, which is a silent film based ostensibly on Jack the Ripper. You have his English period, The 39 Steps.
Yep.
What is it? The 10 Little Indians, where you have a person getting revenge on people on an island as he traps them all and kills all but one. You have Joseph Cotton, most famously an Orson Welles protege, who's which is the one where he plays the uncle who's a killer.
Shadow of a Doubt.
Yeah, Shadow of a Doubt. You have the one where the two guys switch, murders, strangers on a train. You have Rope, which is based on a play, which is a daring thing to do then, where he tried to get, there's this 4 or 5 things where it's not one continuous take, but he does that. And then afterwards, after post-Psycho, he did Frenzy, which I really think is an underrated film. For me, the problem with most Hitchcock films is they're too popcorn-based. He didn't take things as seriously, I think, as he did. Whereas with Frenzy, I think if he had started in the 1960s, I think he would have been quite a different filmmaker. I think when I watch Hitchcock films, they're all so utterly drenched in Freudianism. Everything's symbolic. Everything has, every little tick or whatnot has to have some kind of explanation for it to work. What is your take on Hitchcock versus, say, modern people like the Scorseses, the De Palmas, etc.?
I think the closest adherent we have to Hitchcock is probably Park Chan-wook. There's also the Coen brothers. Yeah. Although I believe one of the Coen brothers is retired or is working separately from him. The brothers are working apart, I should say. But yeah, Hitchcock's interesting because, he works from the silent era on. There are a bunch of British non-suspense films he worked on, in fact, that we don't really talk about. I actually ended up writing about one that, again, no one has seen these. And it's a good question. I think Hitchcock now would be a lot more explicit, of course. I mean, I think Frenzy indicates that, his later films in general. Have you ever seen The Trouble of Charlie, by the way? Very strange Hitchcock film. It's set in
Trouble.
New England.
Is that okay? What year is it?
It's like 1963. It's post Vertigo.
Okay.
Uh,
No, I haven't.
Very strange movie. Shirley MacLaine, and the idea is like this dead body keeps popping up in this small town in the wrong places.
Huh.
Yeah, it's an interesting movie. It's very New England, where I'm from, so it's why I was like, I get it. But um, I think Hitchcock would probably be a lot more explicit, probably a little less implicit. I do think that symbolism gets exhausting. I think you're right. Um, I think other filmmakers have taken on his approach, but they're a lot more instinctive. Uh, Maybe more Jungian too. I mean, I think
Yeah.
Park Chan-wook is very good at creating these primal images, like an old boy.
Hmm.
These very like powerful religious imagery too.
Okay. Yeah, I've not seen any of his stuff, so I can't comment on that.
Old
Um,
Boy is incredible. I cannot recommend it enough. It's an incredible movie.
yeah. uh, the closest counterpart to Hitchcock uh, during his era was Clouseau, H.G. Clouseau from France, whose most famous film in the crime genre, at least, is Les Diaboliques,
Hmm.
which is a Hitchcock tried to get the rights for it. Um, and then I think of other people. The late '60s. Who was the fellow who did Army of Shadows? Who also did the one with the crime guy, who's the
Oh,
hitman?
Melville, right?
Yeah, yeah, Melville. Yeah, his stuff is interesting. What role do you think people? Because I'm not a big fan of the French New Wave per se, but Godard and Truffaut. What do you think their films added to, if anything, to the genre of crime films?
Well, Breathless is interesting because it's almost it is a Marxist dissection of a crime film, right? And a very postmodern one. It's a postmodern crime film, I would say. Maybe one of the first, and I do think that is significant for the genre. That Belnardo, is that his name? The actor, the main character.
Belmondo.
Belmondo wants to be Bogart. Like
Yeah.
he idolizes this mobster character, and but he follows the narrative, right? He's betrayed and killed, but there's this inertia and boredom to it that is this very late capitalist feeling that I personally related to as a millennial. This sense of ennui. I don't always know how to feel about Godard. Otherwise, I do think his views of women are not the best, but neither was Hitchcock's.
Yeah.
Um, I think that those directors aped Hitchcock and brought that postmodern sense to the proceedings. I was also thinking of an American film, Charade, from 1963, which is Cary Grant's last film as a lead, really.
Okay.
And that's a very post Hitchcock movie. I mean, the view from the coffin shot is very funny and like very Hitchcockian.
And well, it takes right from what's his name's film, Dreyer's Vampire.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Um, uh, One of the things I much prefer the Japanese New Wave and some of the crime films there. The Insect Woman. What's the one where the faces? Oh, the to me the Japanese really got. Well, you spoke of the ennui of sort of the French New Wave. I think they took it and made more of a farce of crime films, whereas the Japanese went far more deeply interior. And even before the Japanese New Wave, I mean, if you look at something like Only the Bad Sleep Well by Kurosawa, I mean, how relevant is that to today's corporatized world? I mean, they get away with it. And the bad guy we never see. We don't even hear him. He's got the main bad guy that we see on screen is just an underling. You know, he's a middle management underling, and the guy who's really behind it all we don't see, and he gets away with it.
So that's an element of the 60s and 70s crime films that becomes increasingly prevalent, is just this sense of not that crime doesn't pay, it's that crime will not pay you well. You will never see who will pay you. and you might get rubbed out in the meantime. Have you ever seen Mikey and Nicky?
Yeah, the Cassavetes. We'll get to him in a bit, but go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's another movie where, yeah, all these films have this sense of the crime organization as corporation, that everything is becoming more faceless and impersonal,
Mhm.
and that this means that you are disposable as an employee. So there's this new Marxist kind of anti-capitalist slant to, especially the '70s crime films, internationally too, which I think is kind of refreshing. That like people start to acknowledge these pitiless forces that are kind of stacked against you, as we'll talk about later too.
Yeah.
And that's a big element of later crime films and later noirs, I think, especially.
Well, that leads. I was gonna bring him up. The films of Sam Fuller, Underworld USA. His film with the gal who starts off getting her wig pulled off. She's bald and she starts beating the guy to death. I think it's with her shoe. Sam Fuller. I mean, the B kind of crime films where there's the one where the reporter goes into the insane asylum to ferret out what happened to some crime. You get these sort of Byzantine plots, but I find a lot of that. To me, when I look at Sam Fuller, I look at the kind of stuff that I think the French were trying to do, but they didn't really want to go as deeply or as I mean, I can't imagine, for example, Godard doing a thing where a reporter goes undercover into an insane asylum to expose some crime. You know?
Godard is theoretically great. I do think it's that lack of emotion sometimes that is a problem. And Shock Corridor is not like that. It's a
Yeah,
very
Shock Corridor. Yeah.
emotional movie. It ends on this devastating note. It's almost as if the journalist has been driven insane by the injustices and horrors he's had to see. He's, had to talk to these patients who are insane not just because of their minds, it's that the system has broken them down to some degree, that they can't cope with racism or having to turn traitor. It's really tragic.
Yeah. And the fellow I was thinking of earlier that pushed the woman down the steps in the wheelchair is Richard Widmark, his character named Tommy Udo in
Mhm.
Kiss of Death, another great film noir. And so, since we're backward to the film noir, what do you think about an actor like Robert Mitchum? He seems to me to be the sort of embodiment of the American male film noir.
Yeah, it's really notable too that we were talking about George Raft being a criminal at one
Yeah,
point, and Mitchum, he wasn't a criminal, but he was a drifter. He was a
yeah,
hobo
yeah,
for like from like his teenage years on until he was like 25, and then like an executive liked his face. That's how he became an actor,
yeah,
and that's really notable because um you can feel Mitchum's experience in these movies. I'm thinking of Out of the Past, right?
yeah,
Which is probably one of the quintessential American noirs. And Mitchum has the sense of a guy who's lived and he's lost, and he has this really ambivalent relationship, right, with this ex he fell in love with. And as well as Kirk Douglas as this really jaded mob boss. The movie, yeah, Mitchum had this real sense of looking weathered, especially when he was older too.
yeah,
He aged well, but like he looked like a guy who'd seen some things. Also thinking of The Friends of Eddie Coyle, the
yeah,
fantastic Peter Yates Boston movie.
yeah. That's a good one. Um, uh, One other guy that I want to talk about too that isn't often associated with crime films, although he obviously did some, is Billy Wilder. And the two that stick out, the obvious ones, Double Indemnity and Sunset Boulevard. And Wilder, what I think makes Wilder stand out, and why, for example, I prefer him generally to Hitchcock. I like Hitchcock, but I think Wilder overall is a better filmmaker, is because Wilder brings a kind of humor and irony that I think Hitchcock strove for, but didn't quite nail. You look at Sunset Boulevard. There, even besides the ending where she's coming down the stairs, I'm ready for my close up, Mr. DeMille kind of thing. There's there's a sense of this is a crime film. We're going to look at it anatomically, but by the same token, it's still a film. And I think you get that even who's the gal in Double Indemnity with McMurray?
Oh, Barbara Stanwyck.
Yeah, Barbara Stanwyck. You get this. She's not the typical film noir woman. She seems to be. She seems to be more flexible. There's a depth to her that a lot of the femme fatales don't have. What is your take on Billy Wilder? Those two films and any others that might come to mind?
Oh, Billy Wilder's one of my favorite filmmakers. Even as a kid, I grew up on The Apartment. That was the first of his I watched, and then I just loved all of them.
And
But
what's the one with Lemon and Mathau where they're trying to scam a lawsuit with the
oh, The Fortune Cookie.
fortune
Yeah,
cookie? I mean, that's technically a crime film because they're trying to pull off
yeah,
fraud, but it's still very funny. And it did that come after? I think that came before. I think a year before The Odd Couple. I think.
yeah. It did. Yeah, that's their first team up officially.
Yeah.
It's funny. So big fan of Wilder and Sunset Boulevard, especially the gothic feeling of that movie is still incredibly powerful, and I think it speaks to the sense of Hollywood as a place with a lot of horrors and um, this darkness buried underneath, right? The mansion, especially, becomes so symbolic and so powerful. And Wilder's difference from Hitchcock, I think, is the verbal dexterity. Like, he was just such a great dialogue writer. There are so many lines in Sunset Boulevard I can just think of off the top of my head. There's the joke about the guy who says, I turned down Gone with the Wind. I thought who would ever want a Civil War picture? Um, and just all these great lines. Sunset Boulevard also just really invests in the poignancy of the main character, and even Joe, the main character, the narrator. Also a really macabre, really dark device is that Joe narrates the movie from the grave.
Yeah.
I don't know if a lot of crime films had done that before, if ever. It's really striking still, and like really adds to the sense of doom hovering over the movie, the fatalism
Yeah.
that Norma, will never get the comeback she needs, and that Joe won't either.
Uh, I mentioned Widmark, and he stars in what I would call a noir western. I don't know if you've ever seen a Yellow Sky. It's with
I haven't.
uh, who the hell is the? Oh, I have to look it up. But it's a western noir. It has. I'm going to look it up here just quickly here. Yellow Sky. It has an all-star cast, and it's a crime film that I'd recommend, but I won't spoil it. Yellow Sky, 1948, and it had Gregory Peck, Ann Bagstow, Richard Widmark, and who else did it have? It had Harry Morgan, who played on MASH, uh,
Yeah, yeah.
and a few others. But that brings to mind too that when you look at crime films, you'd have to include too some of the westerns because before you had gangsters in popular culture, you had the dime novels of Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and all these names from the western. And something like High Noon is quite a different beast from not only the westerns that came before it, but also from crime films because basically you have the one guy standing against. I guess they're based on the Clanton gang from Arizona,
Yeah.
coming back to get revenge or whatnot. And then you look at a lot of the films that came after that. They involve crimes or the cover of crimes. The man who shot Liberty Valance, the guy who
Yep.
thinks that he kills them, Stewart, isn't the killer that he thinks he is. Um, uh, what is your take on some of these sort of blends where you get crime films mixed with westerns or other stuff?
Yeah, I think it's crucial that I think the aim of Western and crime films are often pretty different, which is funny. The Western often ends with the establishment of order, and the crime film ends with disorder, or an acknowledgement that the order that we have is broken in some sense.
The spaghetti
And
western is that, you know.
yeah, yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I grew up. My dad raised me on like anti-westerns, so I watched as a kid. I watched the Clint Eastwood
Yeah.
spaghetti westerns. I watched Little Big Man,
Mm.
so I'm watching these movies about how the Native Americans are actually the good guys
Yeah.
and the cowboys are terrible. But this actually, helped me watch like Man Who Shot Liberty Balance and The Searchers with a new light. Especially that like, John Wayne in The Searchers is a psychopath. His character
Yeah.
is terrifying.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, there's that scene too with Jeffrey Hunter where he's making fun of his Indian wife, calling her fat and all this.
yeah.
And I have to say, the thing is, I'm not a big John Wayne fan, and John Ford I think was very hit and miss. And I think The Searchers has merit, but I think, and Wayne is actually pretty good in it. But Jeffrey Hunter, to me, gives one of the worst performances in a Western I've ever seen. I mean, his character is just cardboard, cut out. And then the thing is, you watch him, if you've ever watched him in that, the role in Star Trek, the original pilot, he's quite good. And it's like, what the fuck were they doing in there? I mean, was it just such a poorly written, or was he just too green when that came out? I don't know.
He's really boring, and I don't know if that's his fault. It's a boring character. He just has to keep reacting to everything Tom does and being like, "You're a bad guy."
Yeah.
And he has to romance this girl. That's all he's trying to do. It's pretty tedious.
Yeah. Well, before we hit New Hollywood and take a break here, let me just bring up one other film that I think is vastly overrated and yet is always up there for its criminal. That's Night of the Hunter with Lawton, and it's got Mitchum in it. To me, it's just so stagey. I mean, it's almost as if it's trying to evoke the German expressionism, but the love hate on the knuckles, and the whole performance by Mitchum. He's so much better for me in the other noirs, and I'm kind of glad that that's the only film that Lawton ever directed, because to me it's got the worst. That Hitchcock, that kind of sort of self-referential, am I not being smart kind of thing. And I think, when did that come out? Did that come out the same year as Psycho?
No, I think it was earlier.
A few years earlier. It to me looks like Lawton was trying to do Hitchcock, but not doing well. What is your take on that? Because I know I'm an outlier on that. I'm not. I just don't think it's a particularly good film.
I love that movie very dearly. That's one of my favorites. I have it on Blu-ray as well, actually. But I just think of that movie as such a beautiful dream. There's something so much dreamier about it than Hitchcock's movies. It has this feverish quality, that Southern Gothic quality. And I also just love the shadows and the music. It's a very big movie. I don't know if every swing it takes works. I think what it does with Mitchum especially is so compelling. Really, like, bring him to a weirder place. Like this scene where the kids get away and he just starts screaming bloody murder. I don't know if a lot of actors were pushed to that extent in a movie. Like a very strange scream. He doesn't sound human.
Yeah. Well, I actually thought he was better in the original Cape Fear. And I'm not a big fan of the remake with De Niro, even though I think De Niro overall was a better actor than Mitchum. That was just, to me, an unnecessary remake. So, Connor, let's turn to New Hollywood. By the mid-'60s, the studios were running out of gas. You got young filmmakers who were getting their opportunities. There were a lot of black and white films that sometimes they were mixtures. Have you ever seen 60 Seconds? Well, I mean not 60 Seconds with Rock Hudson. He plays a guy who falls prey to this cult that will promise to make your life, if you pay them enough money, they will give you a new identity. They'll give you plastic surgery, and you can't get out of the cult though, and you have to bring people in. And so it's interesting because Rock Hudson was a closeted gay man. It has a touch of those things, but it's another film very much like The Bad Sleep Well. It's an American film by Frankenheimer, and it's almost totally forgotten. Have you ever seen it or heard of it?
My stepdad actually owns a copy. That's one of
Oh,
his favorite films. I actually haven't seen it yet, but I do like Frankenheimer a lot. I
yeah.
do want to see that one. Yeah,
Okay.
it's on my list.
Um, so probably the most famous example of new Hollywood crime films is Bonnie and Clyde.
Yep.
Um, and that, like many other films, was condemned for its violence there. Even though that came out, I think, a year before The Wild Bunch, which is another sort of crime western film. What
The
was your
Wild Bunch makes Bonnie and Clyde look like roses in tea time.
yeah
All
yeah
right.
yeah. But yeah, so go ahead. Tell me your takes on those two films if you want.
Yeah, big fan of the Wild Bunch. I've actually written about it before. Love Peck and Paw, and
Yeah.
the Wild Bunch is such a significant western in that the outlaws are very much the heroes. There is almost no ambiguity about it. I mean,
Yeah.
they are scum. They will do some evil shit. William Holden shoots a woman near the end of the movie, and but you also come to understand them that this is the only way they felt they could live properly,
Mm.
and living outside of the system to some extent or trying to profit off it is something you understand, this brotherhood in a weird way that forms between them. So I think that's really significant. Actually, similar themes in Bonnie and Clyde, similar ending. Wild Bunch actually is a more hopeful ending, because Robert Ryan gets to go off with the Mexican Revolution, which is
Mm.
great. Uh, but with Bonnie and Clyde really is this cry from American youth culture. Notably, Wild Bunch, all these guys are older. They're in their 40s. They're movie stars. They're Ernest Borgnine, Holden. Bonnie and Clyde made stars out of Dunaway and Beatty, and they are young. They're very young. Now, what people forget about Bonnie and Clyde, though, is that it did get released and dropped almost immediately. The studio didn't want to promote it. They didn't
Mm.
understand what they had. Roger Ebert was actually the first critic to champion the movie. And he said, like, I did it. I helped this movie come back.
Mm-hmm.
And Beatty had to beg the studio to re-release it, and it was a huge hit. So, it changed Hollywood completely.
Um, as a consequence of uh, what we call the new Hollywood, uh, B films also took a turn into crime films, and the most, I guess, notorious or the most obvious B genre that came out of that was the slasher film. Eventually, it started with things like Last House on the Left, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Uh, uh,
Black Christmas is another really meaningful one.
yeah, and then later on you'd get things like Prom Night, and then you'd get the super killers. Michael Myers and he's Friday the 13th.
Yeah, Halloween.
Halloween. Friday the 13th is
Yep.
Jason,
Yeah.
and then Freddy Krueger and the Nightmare on Elm Street stuff, and that basically dominated the '80s in turn. Now they're technically, I mean, they're more monster films than crime films, but again, there's that blurry difference. But when you start out with something like Last House on the Left, with this very Manson family like thing, and it's based upon Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring, which was about the death of a knight and killed by a rogue band of bandits. Talk a little bit about how that sort of morphed or became an offshoot of the new Hollywood.
Yeah, it's notable that a lot of horror filmmakers and really blockbuster filmmakers, a lot of these guys all started, I mean, Peter Bogdanovich too, a lot of art guys, they started under Roger Corman. Joe Dante, Spielberg, Scorsese. These guys are getting budgets and cameras, make whatever they want, and that's really what's key. Is Roger Corman's like, you make it as cheap as you want, you make whatever you want. You just have to make it under a certain amount of money, and it will sell. Like I'll sell it, and it's notable. Like Peter Bogdanovich does. What's that? The Boris Karloff film, The Sniper.
Sniper? I don't know.
Yeah, Boris Karloff plays like a movie star. He has to stop a sniper.
Huh.
It's a '60s film. I can't remember the name of it. Targets. And
Okay.
so there's that one. Joe Dante makes movies around the period. Scorsese, Spielberg.
Yeah.
A lot of these guys are starting in the B movie circuit and then moving up. Same with Scorsese. He makes Boxcar Bertha for
Yeah.
Corman, which is a Bonnie and Clyde ripoff.
Yeah.
Speaking of, and Uh, what's significant, I think, is like a lot of these guys are learning on the fly, and then they're adapting this for horror and crime or whatever they want to make. John Carpenter is a really another example. He makes this sci-fi movie Dark Star, and
Yeah.
then I think a couple years later he makes Assault on Precinct 13,
Mm.
which is really unusual. It features these like zombified like LA gang members,
Yeah.
like a horror crime film almost. And then that finally he makes Halloween. Halloween really kicks off the slasher in a sense. Although, you could argue Bay of Blood is the first real slasher, the 50s Italian movie, the 60s one.
Mm.
Mario Bava. Big fan of Mario Bava.
And the thing that's interesting, I think, is that how these sort of slasher films kind of merge and with like sort of I mean, because we didn't mention James Bond, the supervillain kind of crime film, if you will. James Bond did that. Then you get the Die Hards. You get all these spectacular things, and that's almost the supervillain alongside with these sort of B film slasher films. They become kind of really dominant in the 80s and
Yeah.
90s. I mean, yeah, you have Scorsese that we'll talk about in a bit, but um, where do you rate or where do you place the supervillain, if we will? And when I say supervillain, I mean still human super, not Marvel comp movie supervillain, but
Yeah.
the Bond, Die Hard franchise kind of supervillain that wants to whatever.
The Gary Oldman or the
Yeah.
Alan Rickman. Yeah. My only problem with Die Hard is that I want Hans Gruber to win. I kind of like the guy. I don't, I want him to win. I like his scheme. It's a good scheme.
Mm.
Um, yeah, my problem with the supervillains is I like them in theory. The older I get, the more I just don't relate to the scenarios of the story as much, of
Yeah.
course. They're fantastical, and I totally respect that. I get it. It's just not as interesting to me now as like Killing of a Chinese Bookie, which I watched last night, and like Ben Gazzara as Cosmo, his desperation. Like, I think there's this big difference in um, not just where these movies are in terms of like the class strata, um, but also that they just they aren't grounded at all, which is fine. Again,
Mm.
it's fine to make Air Force One. I respect it. I also the older I get, the more I'm not interested in the stories as much. I mean, even the Batman. I love Batman movies to some extent, but also as I get older, I'm like, I get it. I get it. It's a fantasy. It's a power fantasy.
Well, you mentioned I was going to bring that up later, but let's touch upon it now. I've always said that The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, the longer version especially,
Yeah.
is the greatest gangster film. Not only is it the greatest gangster film, but it's the most realistic. I grew up in a very Goodfellas type neighborhood, and when we talk about Goodfellas, there's such obvious bullshit there that. But when you talk about dopey, average guys who are just killers and whatnot, the blonde guy with the mustache whose name I forget.
Seymour Castle.
Seymour Castle, yeah. He's such. I mean, he is the perfect representation of the actual American gangster, far more so than the Corleones or any character that De Niro played. That is what your typical American gangster, as I was growing up in the late 20th century, was like. And you mentioned in the longer version, there's that great monologue that he has about his black girlfriend when he's at the girlfriend's mother's house, and
Yes.
he's talking, and he's been winged. We don't know if it's a fatal shot. We don't know if he dies, after the credits or whatnot. But he's going through the 7 cycles of grief or whatever stages of grief when you're seemingly coming to death kind of thing, and and it's such a great performance by Gazzara. I mean,
Yeah.
and the thing is, when you look at the rest of his filmography, he's done some good stuff, but this is just absolute top 10 performances by a male in any American film.
It's amazing. Uh, what I really like this description of Mort is the character you're
Yeah,
mentioning, Seymour Castle, because yeah, he's so full of shit,
yeah,
and one of the things I think is great about this movie is that the word gangster or crime is never mentioned.
Yeah.
That it is all just implicit under the background is that everybody here is in crime. Cosmo is mobbed up clearly
Yeah.
in some way, right? Like
Yeah.
he knows all of these guys.
Yeah.
And I think it's crucial that the movie just has the gangster life on the simmer. It's always just on the back burner. It's always there, just like real life.
And we really know nothing about him other than he's a Korean War vet.
Mhm.
We don't know what happens to him after the film if he actually died. We don't know what came before, but he also is ballsy because he tells the one guy he owes money to in the first 5 minutes, I don't want to ever see you again. He's got a sense of elitism, like I'm better than this, but yet he isn't. And we don't know where he picked up. I mean, he within 24 hours or 48 hours of being told he has to take out this bookie to erase his debts, he comes up with a seemingly ingenious, however simple plan, and a little bit of chopped burger is his entree to murder off presumably a powerful head of the Chinese syndicate out west, the triads or whatever they're called. And you look at a lot of these other gangster films, even the great ones, like the first couple of Godfathers, or the Scorsese 3 or 4 that he did, and there isn't that. There are a lot of contrivances, and I'll get into some of them when we talk about them, that just aren't here. It's just a very simple film, but it has these moments that just soar like Himalayan Shakespearean moments. The guy who my favorite character is probably the guy who's the announcer at his club, Mr. Wonderful, is it?
Yeah.
I mean, these kinds of they just reek of the street.
I love this is a movie about an artist who doesn't want to be a gangster. Like he has designed and choreographed this strange burlesque. I
Yeah.
mean, it is grotesque. I almost understood the audience being like, "Let's just bring out the girls. Like, what are you doing to us? We just want to see boobs."
Yeah.
And I think what's significant, yeah, he says this really key line early in the movie. He says, "You don't have any style," and the other guy goes, "You don't mean have class?" And he says, "Not style, not class, style." I think it's really interesting. Cosmo sees himself as stylish or like a man's man. Like he brings an orchid to each of the strippers at his club, which is like I really thought was a very endearing move. Where it's like, but then he gets drunk and he gambles $23,000.
Yeah.
Like this is a mess of contradictions.
Yeah. So obviously, then let's go back a few years, and you get The Godfather, and we'll talk about how Scorsese plays off that, and versus some of these other films and Cassavetes. So The Godfather, I don't know. Have you ever read the book?
Actually, no, I've read of it. It's one of those things where you read about the differences between the book and the movie.
Yeah.
The book clearly goes into more depth about certain things.
But it's also a lot hokier. It's also a lot more predictable because Sergio Leone, not Sergio Leone. Who's the Godfather? Right?
Mario Puzo.
Puzo, yeah. Puzo is like Scorsese in that even though they're both Italian, both of them have admitted they really didn't run with that crowd. They only heard little whispers on the edge, and this is why The Godfather is so Shakespearean and fictional. Is that it's the idea, it's the mythic idea of these people that are really the people like the LA gangsters in Bookie, but it's gone through the mill of the mind and become something more like a King Lear or a Hamlet.
It's ritualized. Everything is about, you have to make an offer you can't refuse the day of my daughter's wedding. It's all these little rituals that have become, I like the comparison to Shakespeare. And chivalry is kind of in there too, like this weird, like very fake Italian mob family chivalry that I don't know if it's real or not, and it's not a real movie in that sense, or not a real depiction of the mafia, but as a tragedy, it's fantastic, especially part 2, which I really didn't like for a long time and then reevaluated, and now I think is amazing.
Well, I'm not a fan of number two. I think the irony. I think De Niro gives one of his weakest 1970s performances. I mean, it's just all affectation. He doesn't convince me that he's Brando, and I don't really get why it's there. Did they not have enough stuff for Pacino? Pacino is great, and the Pacino section I think is as good as anything in the first one, but De Niro, I mean, I think of his role in 1900. I think of his some of his other roles uh, that should have won, and I don't know. To me, I mean, it's not as bad as number three, which I don't think is a terrible film. It's just a mediocre film. This one I think is a good film, but I don't understand the people who say they think number two is better than number one. What is your take on one and two?
I still think one is better. I think Godfather 2 is a lot. Rewatching it, I was like, this is still pretty extraordinary. I think the contrast between Vito and Michael is more powerful for me on rewatch. That there's this void between them, that Michael is not good with people. He does not, he doesn't know how to incorporate family and ritual into his life and into the mafia as much. His world is a lot colder and meaner. Like it ends so perfectly on Michael just staring into the wind. He has nothing left at the end. He has killed his brother, he's sinned against his kin. There's something so powerful about that. And in contrast to Michael and Vito kind of creating his own life, he has created his life, and yet here is the actual fact of it, that he has created children who kill each other.
Yeah. Um, I compare the scene in Chinese Bookie when the blonde-haired guy and Gazzara are in the car park in the parking garage, and I
Yeah.
compare it to the one where the brothers are mowed down in the first one, and you know, I'm perfectly fine with this is art. This is a grandiose statement, but to me, it. One of the reasons I think that Bookie is a better film than The Godfather, and even better than Scorsese's, is it is so grounded in reality. Uh, there comes a point when I think you could sustain the mythos within the first film, but when you have the second film, I think there wasn't as much material. They didn't base it off of the Godfather book, the stuff that was left out, and then by the time they did 15 years later, number three, it was just there was nothing left there. You can only do so much with a myth. If you're trying to do Beowulf or whatnot, well, you can't add in Godzilla, as the fourth act after the Grendel, his mother, and the dragon. So I don't know. It just seemed to run out of fumes. Whereas with Scorsese, the interesting thing with me is in his three or four major crime films, Mean Streets is another very good film. It's not as good as Chinese Bookie, but
Yeah.
you can argue it's great in that it has a sense of the reality.
Yeah.
Taxi Driver obviously is a crime film, but that's more of the cycle, and that's I think his totally best film. You can make some arguments about the mob in Raging Bull being a crime film. Okay, you have the Jerry Lewis film. What's his name? The, what's the Scorsese one? The King of Comedy. That's a crime film, but again, this is a minor nut job that pulls off a thing. Then of course you get the Goodfellas, and Goodfellas has if Shakespeare is what would produce The Godfather, this is the ultimate Hollywood gangster film, whereas something like say The Sopranos to me is just a soap opera. And then you have, what is it, Casino, and then The Irishman is a really bad film. I watched that and I was just agog at how bad it is. I don't know if you but let's go along the continuum of those 6 or 7 crime films with the first one, Mean Streets. What was your take on that?
I love Mean Streets. I mean, Scorsese's probably one of my favorite filmmakers. I mean, Goodfellas is probably my favorite movie. I mean, I could just put it on and never get tired of it. You know, I'll just like have it on in the background or something. I love Mean Streets, though. I love how that mundanity it captures. You're right that like it feels real. I think of the fight scene in that movie as so realistic of guys just trying to grab each other and
Yeah.
being clumsy. That it's not well choreographed, and it's so well done and so funny that like yeah, this is actually how people fight. It's not like beautifully timed and well done. There's no choreographer for you, you know. But I'm also thinking too of like Harvey Keitel's character and how like he is. What's the first line of the movie? Scorsese says it out loud. He says, "You don't make up for your sins in your church. In the church, you make up for them in the street. The rest is bullshit, and you know it."
Yeah.
But you know, I've lived by. You know, I get that. Yeah, you make up for your sins in the street. That Catholicism is something I think is just really powerful. That Charlie puts his hand over the candle like he thinks he's going to hell on some level.
Yeah. How about Taxi Driver? What was your take on that? As this is sort of realistic
Mm.
version of a psychopath versus, say, the Hitchcockian more version.
Well, I'm a big fan of as well Paul Schrader, of his filmography in general, and Schrader has rewritten Taxi Driver a lot, and it's interesting because a lot of them have more of a sympathetic protagonist, and Travis is sympathetic to me up to a point,
Hmm.
and then you're like, oh, this guy's terrifying. But it's notable that Schrader based the movie on the diaries of the guy who tried to kill George Wallace
Yeah.
in the 1960s, and what's significant is how much it lives in his delusion
Hmm.
while also having these contrasting moments with like Sybil Shepherd and Albert Brooks, Harvey Keitel's character, the pimp, Sport, I want to say,
Yeah.
and Jodie Foster. And these people who are very much living outside of him and can kind of have this reality that they point out to him, you know, and he just cannot quite function in that. He can't function in the normal world. He is dysfunction.
Yeah.
But what's tragic is like no one can really help him out of it. You know.
The only
Um,
the only negative I have of the film is outside the film is that it reinforced the stereotype of the sex worker as victim. Uh,
yeah.
90% of the women in the U.S. and in most of Western society who have been prostitutes have basically been women who were placing ads, Lonely Hearts ads, and taking clients that way. The idea of the predatory pimp that has become so prevalent, you know, basically got its start here. Then through later Tarantino and some of the black crime films, I think this got out of hand. But and then it brings us to Raging Bull, though, because I think this is a. I mean, it's not technically a crime film. There are some mobsters in it, but you can say it's a crime film in that he ends up in jail, Jake
Yeah.
LaMotta, and he's clearly physically abusive to his wife, to his brother, to his brother's wife. This is a guy who just gets off on beating the crap out of people.
Yeah. And what's wild about Lamada is that he puts he goes into the ring wanting to be beaten, you know, as this kind of redemption for his violence in general. That this is what he deserves. It's again the Catholic aspect of the violence is overwhelming. But yeah, on the mob front, I really love that Frank Vincent's character and a lot of these mob guys, they're just in the movie in the background or on the side. Like part of the tension of the movie is whether Jake is going to fight for them and
Yeah.
rig the fight, you know. But it's part of like neighborhood life, which I really like. Is that yeah, crime is just part of the city. It's part of growing up here, growing up in New York, theoretically. You know, if you're Jake,
Yeah.
if you're Joey.
And then Coach from Cheers is one of the mobsters too, Nicholas Colasanto. Um,
Yeah,
but uh, then for me, the most underrated of all of his films, After Hours is underrated, but
yeah,
the king of comedy, there you have the guy who really is a psychopath. I remember when I reviewed Taxi Driver, I was just looking up. When you look at Travis Bickle, he's not a psychopath. I said he has borderline personality disorder. If you look that up, he
Bro.
checks off everything. But Rupert Pupkin is a psychopath because he there's no deviation from him. He could, I mean, he doesn't go as far as Travis in terms of, like, he kills the black kid who's robbing the store, and then he ends up killing Sport, and he kills 5 or 6 other of these pimps or whatnot. But I would rather deal in life with a Travis Bickle than a Rupert Pupkin, because Rupert Pupkin is one of these guys who, could go postal, or he could do something. He just happens to win, much in the same way that Travis just sort of lucks out and wins. What is your take on Pupkin versus Bickle?
I haven't seen King of Comedy yet, actually.
You haven't? Oh, okay.
Well. But yeah, that is such a great recurring feature of these characters that, like, they're not necessarily, like, nice people, and they'll still win, but, either it's a kind of a Pyrrhic victory or you don't know what happens next. Like with Taxi Driver, Travis might win, but, the look in his face, he's not going to stop, is the thing for me. And someone's going to stop him eventually.
Now,
Yeah.
I agree with you. Goodfellas is I think, the best of all these mobs. I don't think it's. I think I give Taxi Driver overall as a film over Goodfellas, but
Yeah.
Goodfellas. The only thing with Goodfellas, as I grew up, I said in that Goodfellas type neighborhood, and I also, when I was a teenager, worked in what would be called the mob front. I worked in a warehouse,
Yeah.
and you would hear all these kind of bullshit stories. And I can tell you a lot of these bullshit, a lot of these scenes which are greatly done are just bullshit. The scene with the Tommy character where, what are you laughing about? Supposedly, Pesci says he heard someone doing that or what. That's an old tale. And there are a number of other little. If I saw the scenes, I'd be, that is something that was a mob legend from the 40s or 50s. Just like with The Sopranos, the lead character going to the shrink goes back to the guy who replaced Al Capone in the Chicago mob. He famously went to a shrink, Frank Nitti. So a lot of these things that are daring or whatnot were just things that happened in real life or were legends and rumors. But it's a great film. I think it's certainly the best of his mob films.
Henry Hill's interesting because, there is a degree to which the movie's real, only because one of the things the Witsec guys said was like, well, he kind of had to tell the truth or you'd kick him out. But he got kicked out anyway. Henry Hill is a strange piece of work.
But the thing is, you got to realize Henry Hill is a guy who's bragging. He's making himself look good, just like what's his name in The Godfather. Coppola was saying that the mobsters there started taking on some of these Shakespearean characteristics to try to make themselves like Don Vito Corleone when they were really the bumbling idiots in Bookie.
Yeah, that's the thing. So, Henry Hill is to some extent telling some of the truth, but he's also this incredibly unreliable narrator, right?
Yeah.
This guy who claims that he never killed anyone, which is probably bullshit. And what's striking is this weird sense of, like, Scorsese engaging with the story, but also looking at it and going, how can I make this as visually powerful and overwhelming as possible? So you just feel what it's like to be in this kind of high octane, high speed life. One of the things that was funny, one of my exes watching the movie said that it really captured what it was like to be in a cult. That the sense of being suffocated by the lifestyle, everyone around you is in it. There's no getting out. You can't really leave. You don't have any other friends or family who aren't in the life.
I'll give you another example. Just came to me of the bullshit. There's the idea that the young Pesci and the young Henry Hill characters, they're, I guess, 12 or 13 when they supposedly first start doing stuff. That's realistic. But they're not going to know the names of the guys they're doing for. They would never meet the Paulies. They would never deal with the De Niro character until they were 18 or... I mean, these guys... And then there's that scene when he's selling cigarettes or something, he gets pinched, or maybe it's when he blew up the car or whatnot. And the whole gangster thing are out there. There's 20 gangsters when, you just popped your cherry kind of thing. That is just so totally ridiculous. And that's Henry Hill just aggrandizing himself. The chances of that happen, I've got a better chance of getting Halle Berry's phone number for a date than that happening.
Yeah, that's pretty silly. Um, yeah, I wonder about Casino too. Casino's interesting
Yeah.
because it's actually third hand, that one, because like that wasn't even anyone narrating the book directly to anybody.
Mm,
That was Nicholas Pileggi getting a lot of sources, but in creating writing his own story.
yeah.
Um, but the weird thing with Casino, by the way, is that they couldn't mention the Kansas mob. So every time they're talking about the mob, they have to say back home, and what they mean is Kansas City.
I didn't know that.
But they couldn't say anything for some reason in the script. Like they were warned about it. Don't
Which,
say anything.
which reminds me, I can't remember the name of the film. There was a great film in the 50s or 60s, a noir film, Kansas City Confidential. Have you ever seen that?
I haven't actually.
Okay, that's a good one.
Yeah.
I won't get into it, but
Yeah.
that's a good one to see. And that brings me to The Irishman. And I saw this 2 years or so ago, 3 years ago on Netflix, and I have to say, it's a typical old man's film. Why the fuck was this made? De Niro, even with the de aging technology, it's so bad. The whole Pacino in the mask to make him look like Hoffa. The guy, and this is another guy. We know he didn't kill Hoffa. We know because he. There's records of him not being anywhere near the murder on that day, and the acting is so. It's so self conscious. It's so it's 180 degrees from Mean Streets and Goodfellas in terms of the energy. It's so dull and boring. And what did you have you seen that? And what did you
Oh
think?
yeah. I love The Irishman though.
You
I've seen
do?
it twice. I think it is so elegiac and bleak in this really beautiful way, especially the last 20 minutes, like when he picks out the fucking coffin.
Mm.
Oh, it's brutal. I like that movie a lot. I think I am really mixed in the CGI. I don't necessarily like it. Someone wrote that it does create this weird sense of being in a memory. The movie creates this weird concept that you are kind of in a memory. You're with these people who are like looking younger because they're looking back on themselves. It's a very weird mix. I wouldn't necessarily defend the CGI, but I also think the movie has a real power because it's capturing this person who doesn't make any real choices of his own and what it's like to have no agency and just kind of go through life doing one thing after another. And then until you do the worst thing imaginable, you know?
What's interesting is there's a scene of a church that's supposedly in a small town in Pennsylvania, but it was actually filmed in Ridgewood, a neighborhood in New York. It's St. Pancras Church in Ridgewood, New York, but it's supposed to be in Scranton or wherever it is. And it's
Oh
like,
yeah.
how did you think taking a picture of a church where you can clearly see it, and it's under Dunk Avenue in Ridgewood? I grew up there. There used to be a Woolworth store when you look one day. I'm like, how do you make that a small town in Pennsylvania? I don't know, but so we have to talk though about sort of the anti-Scorsese, and that's Tarantino when we talk about crime films,
Oh
because
yeah.
he's sort of the big crime film guy who bridges the 20th and 21st century. And Reservoir Dogs I thought was a good film. Pulp Fiction was a good film. The Kill Bill films are getting into cartoonish territory. I think Jackie Brown is his best overall film because it's his most mature, most
I would agree.
realistic, if you will, film. And some of the later films, I haven't even watched some of them because to me it's like watching who's the guy who did the original Batman film? These guys who are stuck in their childhood. Who was the '89 Batman was?
Tim Burton.
Yeah, yeah. What is your take on Tarantino in general and in his crime films? Have you seen any growth or movement in the last 10, 15 years?
Yeah, big fan of Tarantino. And I would also agree Jackie Brown is my favorite movie of his. I love that it's a movie about aging and love. Uh, I think Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is probably his best besides that one, and I think it's because he's just gotten more interested in um, the past and how you know you can't repeat the past, right? That's the famous Gatsby line. But what Tarantino's kind of interested in is like, what if you can change it in movie form? It's the only way you can do it. And what's kind of powerful is that like it's almost a magic trick. I would describe it like Inglourious Bastards, Django Unchained. These are marginalized people taking revenge on the people who in real life killed them or punished them. So Django Unchained, you have this slave who is literally becomes a bounty hunter and then takes revenge on slave owners. Same with and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is really weird in the sense that it has the Manson killings, except they go totally wrong. There's basically a pull of 180. And the result is really magical. It feels very much like a tribute to Sharon Tate, to her as a person, and kind of saying this was a human being. She was stabbed.
Now, is it a Manson-like cult, like with Last House on the Left, or is it Manson?
No, it's the real thing. Yeah.
Okay.
That's the idea. Yeah, and so like Austin Butler plays Tex Watson, the guy who played Elvis recently. So, so the idea is like, what if these guys went to a different house? What if you lived next door to Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate? Is the basic premise of the movie. And it's like a hangout movie, but it's also about getting older. It's about losing things, and it's also about like second chances. I don't know. It's quite a film.
So I want to wrap up talking about the present and the future, since I'm not really actively reviewing films or watching films the way I did. I'm more into my writing, so I'll go to that. But I do want to talk about one other film before we sort of exit the topic here, and that's I think the other film that, like Chinese Bookie, has the most realistic gangsters, even though it's a bit of a comedy, and that's Ghost Dog by Jim Jarmusch. And what I find interesting is that the two guys in all of the gangster films, crime films I've ever seen, that give the most realistic gangsters, they're not Italian. It's a Greek, Cassavetes, and Jarmusch is, what, Hungarian? He's some kind of Slavic. Have you seen Ghost Dog? What was your take on that? I mean, the whole samurai thing is silly, but again, it's the same types of realistic gangsters that are, sort of buffoons, like in Bookie.
I actually haven't seen Ghost Dog either. Okay. That's definitely on my list as well. I love Jarmusch, big fan of his. The most recent crime movie, I'm still really gripped by. The two of them are actually by the Safdie brothers, and they're Good Time, which is Robert Pattinson as a bank robber trying to free his MR brother from jail, and which is an extraordinary movie. And Uncut Gems, which is Adam Sandler as this Jewish jewel dealer who is a compulsive gambler. And they are the movies that most feel like The Killing of a Chinese Bookie to me, in terms of the grittiness and the energy, and having these like interesting actors in small parts. So you have like Eric Bogosian is in Uncut Gems. All these like really weird character actors. Idina Menzel, Lakeith Stanfield, who's great. And that feel like anxiety attacks, though, in the best way, where I have an anxiety disorder. And when I watched Uncut Gems, I could feel everyone in the theater getting uncomfortable, but I'm like, oh yeah, this is just what it's like in my head sometimes, like a good chunk of the time. And I think both of them are really exhilarating, and they feel like 21st century crime films. They're overstimulated and wild, and they're still driven by inequality and this basic need, this want, which I think is what crime films really based on, desire.
Yeah. And how about, what's your take on the future? Because as you mentioned something, there was two other films that came to mind I want to talk about. But where do you think? I mean, I guess when we look towards the future, I mean, gangsters are old hat. The Western is pretty much dead. It might get revived at some point. We've had the Wall Street CEO, greedy son of a bitch trope. Where do you think crime films go the rest of this century, do you think?
I think as long as we have serious inequality and the need in the American dream, this desire for something else, which I think is kind of implicit in our philosophy and our system, We're always going to have crime films.
Mm.
I think more crime films are going to be based in that. I think they're going to be based in not just poverty, but also the need for like basic necessities because that's becoming more of a problem. And I think we'll also have more crime films maybe motivated by climate change, which could be interesting.
Mm.
More crime films motivated by the current moment. We just had an alternative currency basically break down, right?
Mm.
The Bitcoin
Yeah.
has just destroyed itself essentially. So I think that could be interesting as well.
Two other films that came to mind as we were just speaking that I just want to briefly mention feature two really terrific uh, British actors. One is 1998's The Limey by Steven Soderbergh, which features Terence, what's his name? Terence
Stamp.
Stamp, who was a 1960s star, as a guy coming for vengeance over the seeming murder of his daughter. And it the thing that's I find remarkable about the film not only is that it's a great film, but Soderbergh had no clue to the film until he started editing it. He had a much more straightforward film, and as he's editing it, you're getting the right, and you don't know which is memory, which is not. And you get this guy who comes to the U.S. to get revenge, Stamp's character. He eventually doesn't get it, and just like with some of the other characters that we've mentioned, like the Gazzara character in Bookie, we don't know what's going to happen to him at the end. Have you seen that movie, The
I
Limey?
actually haven't,
No.
although I'm not a huge Soderbergh fan, quite
No.
honestly. His films often leave me
I'm
cold.
not either. This is nothing like the 13 films, the
Yeah,
Oceans film.
yeah.
The other one I wanted to mention has Ben Kingsley in Sexy Beast. Have you seen that?
Sexy Beast is great.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's one of the few crime films that maybe it's because it's the Cockney rhyming slang, but it's hilarious. But yet it's also got an intensity. It's probably I think the best crime comedy, if you want to call it that I've ever seen.
It's so funny. I think Goodfellas is still funnier. I
Yeah,
mean, you got Pesci just killing it in that movie,
yeah,
but um, I freaking love Sexy Beast, and Ben Kingsley is just this force of nature. The way he uses language to
yeah,
grind people down in that movie is fantastic. It's
yeah.
so funny. Also love Ian McShane giving Ray Winstone what like $20 at the end of the night, and then being like, "Do you have change?"
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, it was really good speaking with you here for almost
Same.
an hour and 20 or so minutes. And hopefully we'll speak again soon on some of the other topics that you listed. One of the things I do like, I've got a show on American television with a fellow that I've been doing. I like having some recurring guests every 2 or 3 months. So maybe we can do another two or three of these the rest of the year. So
Sure.
I will link to your website. Is it cmcrockford.net or
.net, you got it.
.net? Uh, uh, People can go there for the latest writings and reviews that you've done. So I want to thank you for spending the time with me.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Dan.